Why, hello there, everyone. Welcome to my review of Armored Core 6. I really felt the need to make this review because it seems as if the mainstream is really considering AC6 to be a perfect game, which I definitely disagree with. So I wanted to talk about it to bring to people's attention some of the things that were definitely lost from the older AC games to this game. Because I know, obviously, From Software has gained much more of an audience ever since its Dark Souls franchise, right? So I expect at least a significant percentage of the AC6 players to be newcomers to the franchise, in which case they must be thinking this game is a 10 out of 10, right? Because I think if this were my first mech game, I would probably be over the moon about it as well. And just to preface the video, it's going to sound as if I'm being overwhelmingly negative, but please don't get the impression that I think this is a bad game by any means. I actually think that overall this is a good game. It's obviously a very high quality product with no microtransactions or anything like that. You pay for the game and you get what you pay for and then some. It is a complete experience for sure. And it's actually just a $60 game because this technically is a cross-gen game. I actually managed to get the game for $45 because I saw that Wario64 was sharing a deal in which you can get an Xbox code for the game for $45. So I actually paid $45. But in general, people are going to be forking up $60 for this game, right? And it's definitely worth the money. And so if anybody is interested in getting the game, I definitely recommend you to try it out because if you are interested in the game, you probably will like it, at least to some extent. But my point is that even though I wish people would be more critical of this game, I am glad that it is selling well because if this sells well, it means we can get another Armored Core game, maybe without as big of a wait in between Armored Core 5 and 6. But more importantly, we could start getting copycat Armored Core games, right? Because ever since the whole Dark Souls pop-off, we have been getting a lot of different Souls-type games, right? It's almost become its own genre. You get all these other developers copying the Souls formula, and so if Armored Core proves to be popular as well, maybe these copycat devs will start copying the Armored Core formula, right? And I would be completely fine with that because then we would actually have somewhat of a resurgence in mech games because right now it feels as if this is the only mech game that has come out in a while, right? So even if I don't think the game is that great, another reason why I'm recommending people to buy it is because it's literally the only mech game out there right now, the only one that has released in recent memory. So if you're like me and you have been hungering for a new mech game, this is really the only option you have. So I'm glad that it's at least somewhat good, right? Another thing I would like to preface this video with is that if you ask me how many Armored Core games I have played, I will tell you that I've played 3, but in technicality, I've only actually played one Armored Core game, being Armored Core 2. And there's obviously a very big jump between Armored Core 2 and 6. The other two air quotes, Armored Core games that I have played would include Metal Wolf Chaos. The reason I count that is because it is another mech game by FromSoft, which is very similar to Armored Core. The main difference being that it is more arcadey. I describe it as an arcadey style version of Armored Core, but it's very similar. And like I said, it's also a FromSoft mech game. And the third one is Demon X Machina, which is not a FromSoft game, but it actually is more like Armored Core than Metal Wolf Chaos because Demon X Machina is actually produced. It was actually produced by a former Armored Core producer. So that is an Armored Core game in all but officiality. The reason I mention this is because based on what I have seen of Armored Core 5 and 4, I assume that 6 is much more similar to those two games. I assume that 6 is much more similar in design to 4 and 5 than it is to 1, 2, and 3. So keep in mind, since I haven't played Armored Core 4 or 5, when I critique something about 6, I might not necessarily know if the thing in question originated in 6 or if it originated in 4 or 5, right? For example, I know the hard lock is new in 6. I know the stun system is new in 6, at least in terms of the Armored Core franchise. But in terms of some of the other mechanics, I'm not exactly sure if Armored Core 6 was the progenitor or not. But regardless, whether Armored Core 6 was the progenitor of some of these mechanics or not. If it is in the game, I still consider it up for critiquing, because if it's in the game, I don't really care where it originated from. If it's in the game is responsible for it, even if it didn't start the fight, so to speak. But even with me not having played Armored Core 4 or 5, I still have some experience with more modern mech games in Demon X Machina, because, again, just based on what I know, based on what I have seen of Armored Core 4 and 5, Demon X Machina is much more similar to Armored Core 4 and 5 than it is to Armored Core 2, because Demon X Machina does not have tank controls. Speaking of tank controls, little disclaimer, I actually really like tank controls. In fact, I actually prefer tank controls in my mech games. So I don't want you guys to get the impression when I'm critiquing Armored Core 6 that you think I just automatically dislike anything that's different from the old style of games, because even though I prefer tank-controlled games, I'm not going to hold the lack of tank controls against Armored Core 6, because I understand that Armored Core 6 is obviously trying to appeal to a much wider demographic, and the majority of gamers are allergic to tank controls for some reason, and so I'm not going to hold that against the game when having tank controls versus not having tank controls. It's much more of a directorial decision, right? So don't think that I'm critiquing Armored Core 6 purely because of it being different than the old style of games. My point is that Armored Core 6 is lacking a lot of stuff. It has lost a lot of elements that it did not need to lose, even with it no longer being a tank-controlled game, because these things that it's lacking are completely independent from the presence of tank controls or the lack of. And this is coming from someone who is relatively a casual fan of Armored Core, right? Like I said, I haven't even played that many of the games, and even I can see that AC6 is lacking a lot of stuff. So I can only imagine how much harsher I would be on this game if I were some hardcore fan that kept up with the entire franchise. I actually do want to go back and play the other AC games now, just to see how much in reality this game is really missing. So anyway, back on the topic of Armored Core 6. I have notes here. I'm just going to go through it as bullet points, and I'm going to try to go through this with as little editing as possible. I really would like to do this with less editing than normal, because my last review, which was for Tekken 8, ended up taking way longer than expected. It took me about maybe 10 hours total to create the video from nothing to having it be published on YouTube, and it didn't get that many views, and so I would rather spend less time on my videos, so that way if they don't get very many views, I won't care as much. But on that note, also, if you're watching, make sure you like the video as well. I appreciate it. And so, in terms of Armored Core 6, the notes that I have are divided into categories. So, I have a category regarding the camera, and a category regarding movement and resource management, and then one for difficulty, and finally one for the lack of or the de-incentivization of experimentation. Those are the four main categories I have written down here. So starting with camera, one of the first things I noticed in the game is that the camera sensitivity is weirdly low. I had to max out the camera sensitivity immediately, all the way to 10. I think it goes from a scale of 1 to 10, if I remember correctly. But regardless, I had to max that out immediately. And even with it being maxed out, the camera does not move very fast, which I found a little concerning, because oftentimes as I get more and more used to a game, I want to start increasing the sensitivity higher and higher. And so if I started out the game with maximum sensitivity, that means I had no more room to increase it, right? So I don't know why the camera sensitivity is so low. They could definitely fix that with a patch. Maybe it's different on mouse and keyboard, but keep in mind, I was playing on controller because I was playing on the Xbox Series S, and it definitely runs well on the Series S, by the way, for anyone wondering about that. But the camera sensitivity is so weirdly low. And another thing that really threw me off guard that I had to spend a lot of time getting used to is how the multi-lock works in this game. Multi-lock as in the multi-lock-on. So for anyone that doesn't know, typically in older mech games, traditionally in mech games, the way in which you would aim and lock onto something is that each weapon would have a lock-on box, okay? And if you aim the lock-on box as a target reticle at an enemy, anything within that box would get locked onto, right? And so if you have multi-lock weapons, typically these multi-lock weapons would have a bigger lock-on box, so you can fit more enemies inside of the parameters of this box. And this would give you a wider variety of different weapons and builds, right? Because some weapons would have a wider lock-on box, right? Some weapons would maybe specialize in having a really wide lock-on box, but it would be really short. So it would specialize in locking onto a lot of grounded enemies, right? Because typically enemies on the ground are going to all be horizontally displayed if the terrain is somewhat even, right? If you're locking onto enemies along a horizon line. And some weapons would specialize in having a vertical lock-on box. Maybe a weapon that you would want to use as an anti-air weapon, right? Because if an enemy is in the air flying at you, from your perspective, they would be going higher on the screen, and so it would be harder to track with a smaller target reticle, right? So that's why a lock-on box might be tall, for example. And so this was an interesting element about the weapons that you had to consider when going into a mission, right? But we don't have lock-on boxes anymore, okay? And so not only does the lack of lock-on boxes remove an additional layer of variety that you can have with your weapons, but you no longer know where the actual parameters are to get a multi-lock. So in this game, instead of putting the enemies within the box and having beep, 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 a bunch of these markers ping that you're getting a multi-lock, not too dissimilar from Star Fox, right? In this game, you hold down the multi-lock and it will just, after a time, multi-lock onto anything in front of you. Obviously, you're going to be limited by the amount of multi-locks, right? So even before that was a thing, let's say you have some kind of missile weapon that has 8 missiles, it has a multi-lock of 8, right? And you point the lock-on box at a bunch of enemies in front of yourself, more than 8, you're just going to beep, 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 get a bunch of these lock-ons. You're going to get 8 lock-ons, presumably if they are close enough and in range, right? And then you will get the lock-ons that way. In this game, they still have to be close enough, and you are still limited by the number of lock-ons, right? Naturally. But as I said, there's no way to actually know the parameters because you don't have a box anymore. So when I realized, oh, you don't have to actually hover your target reticle in front of an enemy to get a multi-lock. You just hold the button down, and then after a time, it just multi-locks onto everything generally in front of you. I was thinking, okay, that actually sort of makes sense because I can just assume that anything that I am seeing, anything in front of my mech is eligible for a multi-lock, right? But that's not actually the case because if you get a multi-lock on something and then turn your camera away, the multi-lock will break before the locked on target goes off screen. So there actually is some kind of multi-lock box in effect to some degree, but because it's not visually displayed, you have to kind of just guess and estimate where the parameters of the multi-lock are, which I find very not accessible because, like I said, you just have to get used to where these parameters are, and presumably it's the same on every single weapon. So you can eventually get used to it, but even with them being presumably the same on every weapon, I didn't get used to this until about halfway through the game, and that's when I was finally somewhat comfortable with it. And even with me being comfortable with it, I never found it as reliable as something like the old lock-on boxes, right? And the only reason I can fathom as to why they did it like this is because I think one of the things that video game journalists and the mainstream audiences didn't like about mech games before is that they don't like how convoluted and how information heavy the HUDs were. So maybe they thought that having these overlapping lock-on boxes on the screen would intimidate a lot of casual players, maybe people coming from Dark Souls who aren't used to having a ton of HUD elements like that. That's the only reason I can imagine. But I really wish there were an option to turn that on, right? Because I would love to see where the lock-on parameters are for the multi-lock. So that way I don't just constantly get all of these lock-ons breaking because then I have to wait for the multi-lock to activate again. And that was kind of driving me insane throughout the whole playthrough. I was always having issues with that. Harking on the multi-lock some more, as you have already heard me recreate with my voice, before, when you would do a multi-lock and you put multiple targets in your lock-on box, you would hear beep, 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 beep. You would hear these sounds, right? You would get a sound for each lock-on, and you would also get some kind of red hexagon or a red octagon to appear on each enemy once they have been locked onto, right? So you would get very strong and, might I add, satisfying audio-visual feedback when doing these lock-ons, right? But in this game, the audio-visual feedback is very weak because, first of all, there is actually no sound, or maybe there is a sound, but I just don't remember any kind of sound when doing these lock-ons. It's mostly visual, okay? So you have to rely on one sense instead of two senses, okay? And even then, the visual feedback is very weak and hard to see. So normally when you are doing a lock-on with some kind of weapon that can fire multiple things, such as a multi-lock missile weapon, for example, when you are locked onto an enemy, whether it is in soft lock or hard lock, your target reticle is on that particular enemy, okay? And there is going to be an additional icon by the target reticle. There's going to be a little quarter circle, a yellow quarter circle. It's a very thin yellow line making a quarter circle around your circle reticle, okay? And it's going to have a number by it. That number represents how many, in this case, missiles will be shot at that particular target if you hit the button at that moment, okay? So let's say, for example, I've been saying 8 missiles, right? Let's say, for example, you are aiming at an enemy and you are not holding down the multi-lock for anything. You're not holding down the missile button, right? You're just hovering a lock-on over an enemy. You will see, assuming the weapon is ready, you will see a 90-degree arc filling up, right? Because it's a quarter of a circle, and you will see the number 8 by it, meaning if you just aim at that enemy and you press the missile button, it will shoot all 8 missiles at that enemy because you don't have a multi-lock. You're only locking onto one target, right? So if you're only locking onto one target, it's going to shoot all of those missiles at that target. So if you want to do the multi-lock, you have to hold down the fire button, right? But as you hold down the fire button, it has to refill that quarter circle back up. So if you hold down the button, you will see the quarter circle disappear and then it will start filling back up, okay? And as it is filling back up, the only way to know if you have actually acquired more than one lock-on target is to actually look around and see if any other enemies have this quarter circle bar filling up. Because it's possible that you might only think that you have other targets close enough that are in range for a multi-lock, but you might actually accidentally be multi-locking onto the same target and only the same target again. Because if you hold down that button and you're looking around and you don't have the real estate or the time or the luxury to look at all these other enemies, if you're having to focus on dodging things, for example, you might not notice that you're only locking onto the same enemy again, and you won't notice until you look at that number, which is already pretty small. You have to really squint to see it, right? And you would see that number and you would see it say 8 again. So you have to hold down the button, and for example, you might be waiting and waiting, and then it finally fills up and you think, yay, okay, finally I can do my multi-lock. Let me look at the number to make sure I have a multi-lock before I release the button. And you see the 8 and you realize, dang, I just wasted that time not even getting a multi-lock. Because the only way I would know if I'm getting a multi-lock is if I actually look around and I see other enemies with that quarter circle bar filling up. But like I said, sometimes you might not have the luxury to do that, especially with how hard it is to see that little yellow quarter circle filling up. My point is that the audio-visual feedback leaves much to be desired. Not only is it less satisfying, but it makes it really hard to use. And every time I would do a multi-lock, I would have to squint and lean into my TV and actually look to see what number it says before releasing the button to make sure I actually have the number of multi-locks that I actually think I have. This issue I have with the multi-lock in particular could actually be mostly fixed pretty easily with a patch, and all the patch would have to do would be to make it so the screen immediately displays the number of projectiles assigned to each multi-lock target while the multi-lock progress bar is filling up. So as soon as you start holding down the button to get a multi-lock and you see the multi-lock progress bar filling up, it should immediately display the number of projectiles it will be able to send to each target once the multi-lock is ready, right? Because as it stands right now, if you start holding down the multi-lock, you will see the bar filling up, but you won't see the number until it's filled, right? So you can either wait until it's filled and then see the number, only to be disappointed in a lot of cases, seeing that the number isn't divided as much as you were hoping, or you have to dart your eyes around the screen and count up and actually see all the enemies that are getting multi-locked onto, right? And count up all the enemies, and then obviously in that case you would know, okay, I have that many multi-locks. But on the other hand, if they patched the game as I described, you could look at an enemy with the 8X missile launcher, start holding the multi-lock, and as soon as the multi-lock progress bar starts, you would be able to see a number, right? So let's say in this example, you start holding the multi-lock button and the 8 goes down to 2. You obviously know that 2 is 8 divided by 4. So as soon as you see it go to 2, that means you immediately know, okay, I have 4 multi-locks. You don't have to dart your eyes around the screen to count up 4. You would immediately know just by seeing the number change how many multi-locks you have. You would still have to squint and lean in a bit to see the number change, to see exactly what number it changed to, but at least if it immediately changed as soon as the progress started, you would have some time to visually confirm what the number is instead of having to visually confirm it after it's ready, because if you have to visually confirm it once it's ready, then you're wasting time, but if you are having to visually confirm the number while the progress bar is filling, you're not really wasting any time because you would have to be waiting either way, right? Another thing that's kind of lost in not having the lock-on boxes is that before, at least in Armored Core 2, with the lock-on boxes, when you use the lock-on box to attain a lock-on and then you fire the weapon, that weapon fires a projectile which has some level of tracking, right? Obviously, the level of tracking is going to vary depending on the weapon, but generally every weapon has some level of tracking, some worse than others, some better than others, right? And your opponent can beat the tracking. It can beat the tracking by moving fast enough, or it can even maybe break the tracking. I'll get back to that later, but I think in the older games you could only beat the tracking. There weren't any ways to actually break said tracking, right? So I actually really liked using the bazookas, and naturally, because the bazookas are very high damage weapons, they have bad tracking, so it was very easy to strafe to get away from the bazookas. But I eventually found with enough practice that you could essentially lead your shots to land the bazooka projectiles much more consistently. And the way I did this is that instead of just pointing my lock-on box at the enemy and having them somewhere in the middle and firing the weapon and hoping that the tracking works, you could actually compensate a little bit with skill for the tracking not being good enough by having your lock-on box offset. So let's say I am looking at an enemy who is strafing right. So from my perspective, he's strafing to my left. Instead of just pointing the lock-on box and having him be in the middle of it, I will actually put my lock-on box offset to the left a little bit so that way he will be in the right half of it. So then when the weapon fires, when it initially starts firing, it will fire at a slightly led position, and then it doesn't require as much tracking to actually hit the enemy. So I thought that was really cool when I came to the revelation that you can actually lead your shots to an extent, even with the lock-on boxes, to compensate for some of these weapons not having great tracking. It really felt awesome. That's why I kept using the bazookas in that game. However, in this game, you can't do that because you don't have the lock-on boxes, right? You can't just manually aim a lock-on box around. In this game, whether you are on the soft lock or the hard lock, you can only fire the weapon and then you are completely at the mercy of your weapon's tracking, and you just have to hope that it is going to hit the enemy. So you have a lot less control. You have a lot less room to actually use skill to make things more consistent or effective, which is obviously not as rewarding. For a while in the game, I actually thought I was going to have to rescind this complaint because I saw that one of the upgrades you could get in the OS tuning is that you could attain something called manual aiming. And I was thinking, oh, okay, they don't want you to be able to lead your shots because they want you to be incentivized to unlock the manual aiming upgrade, right? And then you can lead your shots. So I thought, okay, once I get this upgrade, it'll be fine. Once I get this upgrade, it'll be just as fun because I'll have the option to manually lead my shots when I want to. However, the manual aiming OS upgrade is actually not that great because, well, first of all, when you do the manual aiming OS upgrade, it's not like the lock-on box at all, because with the lock-on box, with leading your shots with lock-on boxes, you still have some level of tracking, whereas with the manual aiming OS upgrade, it's just the manual aiming, and from what I can tell, you don't have any kind of tracking at all, okay? But not only that, This leads me to another critique I have. This didn't become apparent until I actually tried doing the manual aiming. For some reason, the dead zone on the camera control is huge in this game. At least on Xbox, using controller, right? I wonder if this isn't an issue on mouse and keyboard, because I would imagine having a huge dead zone on mouse would feel even worse. So maybe the dead zone isn't there on mouse and keyboard, in which case the manual aiming would actually be maybe okay on mouse and keyboard. You guys will have to let me know if anybody played it on PC. But on the controller, I have to move the right stick so far before I get the camera to move. And I'm not kidding. I have to literally move the stick maybe about 1/3 of its maximum throw before I get the camera to move at all. And as I said before, I already have the camera sensitivity maxed out. So when I tried to gradually move the stick, having it go from this giant dead zone straight into the range at which the camera moves at maximum sensitivity, because like I said, I had to max the sensitivity out for general purposes, it just made the manual aiming feel completely useless. So disappointingly, the manual aiming upgrade obviously did not make up for the lack of manual aiming that is afforded to you by the lock-on boxes of the past. Speaking of lock-on, I mentioned already that there is a soft lock versus a hard lock being not dissimilar from the lock-ons of Dark Souls games, even though Dark Souls didn't invent this kind of lock-on, right? Whenever I think of this lock-on, I actually think of Ocarina of Time. In fact, I think Ocarina of Time might have actually invented this style of lock-on, but most people just associate it with Dark Souls, right? And with this being From Software, that is going to lead people to associate it with Dark Souls even more, okay? So I'm actually pretty indifferent when it comes to the hard lock, just because I don't think it really adds much, nor does it really take away anything. However, I would appreciate it for it to work consistently, because a lot of times in boss fights, the main instances in which you would want to use the hard lock, it would just sometimes break. Mostly if the enemy went over you, if a boss jumped directly over your head, my hard lock would just sometimes break. And you can obviously imagine why that would be very disorienting, because hard lock is precisely for those situations, right? You would want hard lock to work specifically in the situations in which an enemy is zipping around everywhere really close to you and you want to keep them in the middle of the camera, right? So most of the time I just ended up not using hard lock, but I would like it to behave a little bit more consistently. I don't know why anything should even be allowed to break it. I don't know if that is explicitly designed. It might be a bug of some kind, right? So that might be able to get fixed in a patch. But something that was an explicit choice for some reason is that there is no radar in this game. I guess in the future, in Armored Core 6's continuity, radars just don't exist. Either they were never invented, or maybe people just got tired of using them. They thought, radars, that's old tech. We don't want old tech. So instead of using radars, everyone in this universe seems to have opted for these Pizza Hut logos that appear on the screen, which indicate the direction from which you are about to take damage, which reminds me of something more like Call of Duty rather than what you would expect to see in a mech game. Not only would a radar give you more information about what is surrounding you, but it would also just be more immersive and realistic, because I don't know how a piece of technology would be able to tell you the direction the damage originated, but couldn't tell you where the originators of the damage actually are, right? So I literally can't think of a good reason for this. Again, it's kind of similar to the lock-on boxes. Maybe they just wanted to clear up the HUD. Maybe just like the lock-on boxes, they were thinking that a radar would be too intimidating for people for some reason. So those are my thoughts about the camera in the game. Somehow simpler than ever before, but also harder to use at the same time. On to my next topic, the movement and resource management. So you already heard me lament the fact that you could not add the multi-lock parameters onto the screen in a lock-on box, right? And that is because you actually cannot customize the HUD at all in this game for some reason, even though you could customize the HUD in Armored Core 2. So why could you customize the HUD in a PS2 game but not a modern AAA 2023 game, right? I think that's insane, especially because I always considered customizable HUDs to be something pretty typically associated with mech games. I don't know if every mech game in the past had that, but when I think about customizable HUDs, the first examples that come to my mind are the mech games with super customizable HUDs, right? But you cannot customize the HUD at all in this game in any kind of way at all. And so I'm using this as a segue to actually talk about the movement and resource management. So another reason why I would like to customize the HUD is because I can barely see some of this information it's trying to communicate. So I don't even know if you guys can see this from the footage you're looking at. But in the middle of the screen, you have your target reticle, right? Obviously. And the ammo count is displayed in these quarter circles surrounding either the bottom left side of the target reticle or the bottom right side. And so you have these two inner quarter circles and you have these two outer quarter circles, right? Adding up to 4 because each one represents a different weapon, of which you have 4. You have a left-hand weapon, a right-hand weapon, and you have a left shoulder weapon and a right shoulder weapon, right? So that's why you see 4 quarter circles, okay? Specifically, though, well, first of all, not only is it incredibly hard to see the ammo count on this, it's a very thin line, right? A very thin line going around the circle in a quarter circle, right? I would typically just look at the actual amount of ammo in the bottom right corner of the screen. I would use that rather than the thin little pencil thin lines around the target reticle. So that wasn't a big deal because I could just look at the actual ammo count, right? But something that I could not search elsewhere for on the screen is the overheat gauge or the heat gauge, okay? So certain weapons, such as the minigun, have a heat mechanic. Obviously, the minigun has a finite amount of ammo, right? Like other weapons, but in addition to it having a finite amount of ammo, it can also overheat, okay? And the only place at which you can see how close it is to overheating is by the target reticle. So instead of giving the overheat its own gauge that you can look at, it is this semi-transparent red bar that is overlapping the ammo bar that's curving around the circle in a quarter circle, right? And because it is sharing the same exact space as your ammo, which is white, and because they are trying to communicate both things at once, the overheat gauge, which is, like I said, red but semi-transparent, gets overlapped on top of the white ammo line. And when it gets overlapped on top of the white ammo line, it becomes this pale pink. Obviously, if the heat were to exceed the ammo, you would then see it turn red again because it wouldn't have the white directly behind it, at least not in terms of HUD elements. But when you have this extremely thin, pale pink line amid these environments that are very gray with red particle effects, especially because you're going to be shooting things with your reticle aimed at the things you are shooting at, right? And so if you're shooting something in this gray environment and the thing you're shooting at is taking damage and exploding and emitting particle effects and everything being kind of gray or red or orangey in this game, it makes it incredibly difficult to actually see the heat level of the minigun. In fact, I actually could not for the life of me identify when these things were about to overheat. I had to pretty much entirely go by feel. I just had to get a sense of how long it took before they started overheating. Maybe other people had a better sense of this. Maybe other people could actually somehow see these super thin, pale pink lines in the middle of their screen. But as for me, I had an incredibly hard time keeping track of that. And my eyes are fine, right? I'm nearsighted, so I have to wear glasses when looking at the TV. But in terms of color blindness, I don't have any of that. So I can only imagine how hard this would be for people that have any kind of vision impairment at all. I think it's crazy you can't have the overheat be displayed anywhere else. You can't even see it on your guns, right? Because they could at least make the guns start glowing orange or something like that. But I wish I could have a separate bar on the right side of the screen, maybe above the ammo, showing my heat so I could manage that a bit better. But yeah, I pretty much had to entirely go by feel with that. And so it made using the miniguns not as fun as they otherwise could have been. Speaking of weapon cooldowns, something that really rubbed me the wrong way when I first experienced it in this game when I first learned about it, is that melee weapons have cooldowns now. And miniguns didn't have cooldowns before either, but I think the reason why it wasn't bothering me very much that the miniguns had cooldowns and the fact that these other weapons have these really long reload times is because this game has essentially adopted the stun or the stagger or the break system of Sekiro. I forget what it's called, but you know what I'm talking about. The stagger system of Sekiro, this game has basically adopted. And when you have the enemy staggered in this game, you have a damage multiplier, which they call direct hit damage. So if you are hitting a stunned enemy, it is a direct hit and gets a big damage multiplier. And so I think as a way to balance that, they want the player to manage their cooldowns and reloads so that way they have enough weapons on the ready, enough weapons at the ready to actually cash in on that direct hit damage, right? So I think that's why I accepted the weapon reloads and cooldowns, but with a melee weapon, it just feels so wrong to have cooldowns on a melee weapon. And in general, I don't think adding cooldowns to a game ever makes it more fun. I don't know if anybody out there would say, yay, cooldowns, please add cooldowns to my game to make it more fun, right? It just feels so wrong with a melee weapon. I understand that they made the melee weapons a lot stronger in this game than before, at least in Armored Core 2. In this game, they have some insane tracking and they do a lot of damage. So the cooldown is probably a way to balance that out. But honestly, I would rather have the swords be weaker with no cooldown so that way I can use them whenever I want. Because the whole beauty of having a melee weapon is that I don't have to worry, or I'm not supposed to have to worry about reloads, right? Because typically, if you're playing a game in which you have guns and a sword, you would be having the sword for when your gun is reloading, right? And then you can just go to town with the sword without having to worry about things like a reload. So it feels weird that the sword is essentially a gun in this game. And so I eventually just stopped using the swords completely because the cooldowns on the swords kind of took the fun out of it. Another weapon that they changed for maybe not the better is the weapon which takes up the 5th slot, which is independent from your hands and your shoulders. I forget what they called it in Armored Core 2, so I'll just call it the 5th weapon. So in Armored Core 2, the 5th weapon would typically be something used for defensive purposes. You would use up your 5th weapon slot for this defensive thing, which would be used to specifically intercept tracking missiles. So some of these 5th weapons would be used automatically, but some of them you could use manually. So from what I remember, there were some that could shoot out lasers. Other ones shot out actual missiles to intercept the missiles tracking you, right? So let's say you have this big barrage of missiles coming and you don't have confidence that you can get away from them. You would then decide to use some of your 5th weapon to intercept these missiles, right? Or, like I said, if you are using one of the automatic 5th weapons, it would just automatically do it for you. But obviously, there's a trade-off there because you don't have to think about it, but on the other hand, it might get wasted against missiles that you could have otherwise dodged easily or tanked, right? And in this case, in Armored Core 6's case, I initially thought that this game just wasn't going to have a 5th weapon because not only does it take a while to get access to this in Armored Core 6, but because you have Quick Boost, which presumably breaks tracking, I got the sense that maybe they want you to just always Quick Boost to get away from missiles, and so maybe they didn't want you intercepting the missiles when they gave you this mechanic to evade the missiles, right? But lo and behold, you do get access to a 5th weapon eventually. What's weird is that you don't buy it from the weapon store like you would any other weapon or like you would in Armored Core 2. For some reason, in this game, the 5th weapon, which is called an expansion in this game, at least in Armored Core 6, they are called expansions. To get an expansion, you can't just buy them like a normal weapon. You can only buy them as a perk, essentially, from this tab called OS Tuning, and you can only purchase them with resources you get from the arena fights. So you can eventually get them, but for some reason, the game considers them this separate other thing. But regardless, when you use the expansion, it is also a defensive thing, similar to the 5th weapon from Armored Core 2. But unlike the 5th weapon in Armored Core 2, it doesn't actually intercept tracking missiles. It's just this big AoE electric shock. It actually kind of reminds me of Blitzcrank's ult from League of Legends, if you know what I'm talking about. but it's just this big electric AoE. And at first, for a while, I was thinking I just didn't understand how I was supposed to use this thing, because I would throw it out every now and then and it would just kind of do some damage, but that was it. It felt kind of underwhelming. So I kept doubting myself, thinking, oh, I'm just not understanding the secret of this weapon. But hearing from other people playing the game, I realized that I actually was using it correctly. It's pretty much just something you throw out when you are surrounded by multiple enemies, and it doesn't even seem to do that much damage, but I think it inflicts a lot of stun, so maybe that's what it's used for, but it wasn't particularly exciting. But the reason I talk about this here in the resource management category in my notes is because you have a finite use of these things, just like how you had a finite use of the 5th weapons in Armored Core 2. So this is something that has a finite amount of uses. However, you can actually upgrade the amount of uses you get per life by spending more of those arena fight resources to upgrade the perk even further. But I just went ahead and got one of them, and because I never really used it very much, I never really bothered to get more of them. So I don't really feel too strongly about this either way, but I felt as if I had to mention it because this is another change to one of the things that I can actually speak about. Another resource that you had to manage was your fuel, obviously. So in this game, you have regular movement by moving the stick around, and you can also boost, which is only a toggle. There's no option to hold the button to get your boost, which I thought was weird at first. And you can also quick boost, which is new, I'm pretty sure. So the quick boost, from what I can tell, is a way to break tracking of things. I'm pretty sure the regular boost doesn't break tracking, it just moves you faster. So depending on where you are and how close you are to an opponent when they fire their weapons, you can beat the tracking with boost, but you can't actually break the tracking. I think quick boost is meant for breaking tracking. It doesn't actually explicitly say that anywhere, but that is the sense I got, because why else would you have this separate thing meant for dodging attacks like quick boost, right? But anyways, I'm specifically talking about regular boosting. So this was another thing that was lost from the other games. So before, traditionally, at least in Armored Core 2, you could also walk around or boost, right? In this case, boosting actually used fuel because quick boost did not exist in Armored Core 2. In Armored Core 6, walking and boosting, neither of those use fuel, but using quick boost uses fuel, okay? But in Armored Core 2, there was no quick boost. So just doing regular boosting used fuel and walking did not. But the trade-off is that aside from your boost using fuel and aside from your boost moving you a lot faster forward, you actually could not turn very well while boosting. So if you wanted to be able to more easily cover your back, or if somebody actually went behind you and they were shooting you in the back and you obviously wanted to turn at them, you would have to let off of the fuel so that way you could turn in place much more quickly. So there was a place for boosting and there was a place for not boosting in Armored Core 2. But in Armored Core 6's case, from what I can tell, there is never a reason to simply walk around without boosting. And that's because your turning speed seems to be the same regardless. If you're not doing quick boost, you want to be boosting at all times. And the weird part about that, aside from just lacking different movement options that are viable, is that you actually have a dedicated button to turn on the boost. Remember, I said it's a toggle, not a hold. Either way, meaning that it would need to have a button. So you actually need to dedicate one of your buttons to the boost. But like I said, you pretty much always want to have boost on no matter what. There's never a reason to turn boost off. So it is a complete waste of button real estate to have a button for boosting when you always just need to have it turned on. There's no thought behind it. You always need to have boost turned on, right? And the reason I say this is a big waste of button real estate is because when it comes to these games, you really have to think about what control scheme you're doing, because no matter what kind of control scheme you go with, you are going to have to do a claw technique in some situations if you want to be able to do everything at the same time, right? So for me, I had all of my weapons on the shoulder buttons, but I was definitely considering putting my left shoulder weapon on one of the face buttons, so that way I could have my quick boost button be on a shoulder button. Because with having the quick boost not on a shoulder button, whenever I went to reach for a quick boost, yes, I could still fire the weapons because I could still have my index and middle fingers on the triggers. But if I had to put my thumb on a quick boost, it means I could not put my right thumb on the right stick to move the camera. But in the cases in which I did want to do all of those things at once, I would have to do a claw technique, which is obviously not ideal, right? So they should have just, if they really wanted to keep this direction, they should have just made boosting the default movement, and they could have cleared up a button, which would have been amazing, right? Obviously, this won't be as big of an issue if you are using a controller with a back button, or also if you are playing on PC, you have way more keys that you have access to, or even if you have a mouse like myself, which is an MMO mouse, which has a ton of keys on the side of it, right? But playing this with a stock default Xbox controller, that was definitely an issue. Still talking about the fuel usage in terms of different types of boosting you can do. Something else that was lost from older games is that whenever you ascended in the air with an upwards boost, right? When I'm saying an upwards boost, I mean hovering in the air. You do a jump, which requires some thrust, so it's going to use fuel, and then you can continue to go in the air, right? So in the older games, at least in Armored Core 2, at least I think this was in Armored Core 2, I know for a fact this is a huge part in Gundam Versus, and so I don't know if I'm just gaslighting myself into thinking that this was also in Armored Core 2, but at the very least, this is something in Gundam Versus, and I think it was also in Armored Core 2, but you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. Whether it was in Armored Core 2 or not, I still think this should be a mechanic in Armored Core, okay? So from what I can remember, in Armored Core 2, when you ascended in the air and then when you start falling, obviously because you need to go in the air before you can start falling, you would have different types of landing. So if you use up all of your fuel to go really high in the air and then you run out of fuel and you come hurtling towards the ground, you slam onto the ground really hard, right? Because you fell from a big distance. And so when you land, there is a recovery animation, and during this recovery animation, you are vulnerable, right? You are a sitting duck for those few frames in which you are in a recovery animation. It might not sound like a big deal, but when you have a lot of enemies around you, it actually is a big deal, right? And so a technique you would have to often employ in the old Armored Core games, in Armored Core 2 at least, I think, you would have to feather the fuel a little bit right before you hit the ground. So instead of burning up all of your fuel in the air doing this big jump, most of the time you should be conscientious about the usage and you should save some of the fuel. So that way, as you are falling, you can feather the thruster a little bit right before you hit the ground, and then you land much more softly. And when you land more softly, you have less of a recovery animation, meaning you can start doing things a lot quicker, such as moving to get out of danger, right? And I thought that was really fun because in some cases, you would have to think, do I want to use up all my fuel in the air? Do I want to go for some kind of big risk, knowing that if I land, I'm going to be vulnerable? Or do I just want to play it safe and save some of my fuel, right? I love resource management. That's one of my favorite things about games in general, right? So I really liked the whole resource management about the fuel in this regard. But in this game, that is completely thrown out the window because you have access to the same types of landing no matter what, no matter how much fuel you've used up. So in this game, if you fly in the air, if you hover and you use up all of your fuel, it doesn't matter whether you are 1,000 feet in the air or 100 feet in the air or 1 foot off the ground or even an inch off the ground. You will land on the ground the same way every time. In fact, I actually discovered partway through the game that if you hit the boost button shortly before you hit the ground, you actually land in a boost. You literally hit the ground running, so to speak. Well, I said literally hit the ground running because you're essentially running, but it's not literally running, right? Because when you're boosting, you're actually sort of skating. But you hit the ground running with little to no recovery at all. I think it's 0 recovery. There might be a little bit of recovery, but it feels as if you land with 0 recovery just by hitting boost right before you touch the ground. And that doesn't require any kind of fuel usage at all because, like I said, boosting in this game doesn't use fuel. So just hit boost before you hit the ground and you're good. You don't have to worry about landing recovery at all. So obviously, I find this less compelling because it requires less thought of the player, less resource management, less risk/reward mechanics. And so it just comes across as more boring and it lets you autopilot more. So something else about the falling, and this I find really weird, there is no option to fast fall in this game. And by fast fall, I mean turning off all of your thrust to fall as quickly as gravity will allow, right? In some games like Gundam Versus, in some builds of Gundam Versus, there's actually a specific mechanic to fast fall, and that you actually have thrusters on the top of your mech, which will push you downwards if you want to fall even faster, if you want to get back on the ground even faster. But I'm not even asking for that. I just wish you could let off the gas to fall as quickly as gravity would dictate, right? It's really weird that they don't allow you to do this, because there are so many cases in which you are in the air and you want to land as quickly as possible, so you are no longer a sitting duck in the sky. It's kind of weird using sitting duck as a choice of words here, because the reason you're a sitting duck is because you are in fact not sitting on the ground. It's because you are in the air. So maybe it would be more accurate to compare it to a leaf, a falling autumn leaf. And as you are falling, all these enemies want to shoot at you, right? It's even weirder when you consider the fact that you can burn up all of your fuel in the air. You can hold down hover, or you can quick boost like crazy in the air, burn up all of your fuel, meaning you are out of fuel. And even being out of fuel, the game will force you into this slow descent, because somehow, even with you being burned out of fuel, I guess the pilot forgot that you actually have this reserve tank somewhere, and he uses that invisible secret reserve tank to have thrust come out of the bottom of your mech to fall more slowly. For some reason. I think that's insane. Why can I not just turn off the thrust and fall as quickly as I want? It's weird. I guess the pilot uses the same secret reserve tank of fuel for being able to do a regular boost without actually burning up the fuel, right? I'm guessing that quick boost and ascending use one fuel tank, and doing a regular boost or falling will use some other secret infinite fuel tank. At least in this game for some reason. Yet another weird thing about the falling in this game that I discovered, this one is way more minor, but it's still worth mentioning while I'm harking on the falling in this game, is that if you are using the quadrupedal legs, the tetrapod, whatever they call it in this game, the quadrupedal legs, and if you are hovering with the quadrupedal legs in place, which I actually found pretty fun. I think it's really cool that the different legs have more unique things about them. So I like that the quadruped legs let you hover in the air, and I like that you can drift with the tank treads, okay? But back on the critiquing of the game, when you are hovering with the quadruped legs, if you turn the hover off, for some reason, the act of turning the hover off uses a chunk of your fuel, which makes no sense, because if you are hovering in place, which is slowly burning up fuel, and you want to turn the hover off, presumably one of the things you would be expecting is for your fuel to start recharging, right? And it does eventually start slowly recharging as you are falling after turning the hover off. But why would the act of turning the hover off use up fuel when you are doing the opposite, right? You're not doing anything that would use fuel. You are turning off a thing that's using fuel. You get my point. Anyway, this didn't really bother me that much, but I had to mention it because a lot of these critiques are minor, but it's just so many little things adding up. And this one particularly made no sense because it didn't make sense from a game design standpoint, nor did it make sense from a real life standpoint. And I'm not someone who obsesses over realism in games. I usually don't care about realism, but usually if you are going to break realism in a game, it would be for the sake of making something more fun. And I don't see how this makes anything more fun. It just seems like a really weird oversight. So in terms of how I have these notes written, the next category I have is regarding the difficulty, but I think I actually want to save the talk about the difficulty for last because that is the most drastic aspect about this game. That is the most controversial. Well, I guess it's not, but it should be the most controversial thing about this game. So I will save that for last, and I will move the lack of experimentation up. So why do I say this game has a lack of experimentation? Well, it's because, for one, the weapons in this game are right side or left side only. And by that, I mean if you buy a hand weapon, it is specifically only for your right hand and not for your left hand, or vice versa. If you buy a weapon, it can only be put on one side. This goes for shoulder weapons as well. If you buy a right shoulder weapon, it cannot be used on the left side and vice versa. So if you have a weapon that you are using on one side of your body, but you want to put it on the other side, you can't. You have to actually go and buy another copy of that weapon, but not an identical copy. You have to buy a copy of that weapon, but one that will work on the other side, which I think is weird. I actually think the reason they did this is because with them buffing melee weapons and with them adding shields, they probably didn't want people to do double sword builds or double shield builds. But if that really was the rationale, why not just have swords and shields be hand specific, or side specific, I should say. Swords are for hands, but the shields are actually shoulder weapons. So if that was the rationale, they could have just made swords left-hand weapons only, and they could have made shields left-hand weapons or left shoulder weapons only. Right? Why did the other weapons, why did the rifles have to be a specific side? It really makes no sense as to why you have to essentially double dip on these weapons if you want to be able to move them from one side to the other. It's not really much of an issue later in the game when you have an ample amount of money to throw around and you can pretty much just buy an extra copy of everything you like anyway. But during the first several parts of the game, I thought it was weirdly limiting that I couldn't just move one of my weapons to the other side. Another reason why I think this game de-incentivizes experimentation is because in terms of the OS tuning, which is essentially a perk system of this game, I think I already mentioned it a little bit in this review, is that you can't actually experiment with your OS tuning upgrades. So with the OS tuning upgrades, these perks essentially, you're able to buy these perks by trading in these resources that you get from the arena fights, which I will talk about shortly. And so you have this finite resource that you are accruing throughout the game, and you can choose to spend them on these OS tuning perks, right? And you can respec the points, but it costs money, okay? And so you would think, okay, I can just get out of paying the money to respec the perks if I just want to experiment with them, because I could make a save, buy some of the OS tuning perks, play around with them in the training mode, and then if I don't like them, I can just load the game, right? Or even if you just want to see what the heck they are or how they feel, because for a while I kept on wondering, how does the manual aiming feel, right? There's also a so-called quick turn perk that I was really curious about for a while, but I ended up never buying it because I was curious, but I was using tank treads and the quadruped legs most of the time, and I never really felt the need to have a quick turn ability. So I never wasted the resources to buy it, because if I bought it and I realized that it was as unnecessary as I was expecting, I would have to respec the points, and I didn't really want to use a bunch of money to respec to get my resources back for a perk that I knew was probably not very necessary in the first place, right? But I would have loved to have been able to save and check out this perk in training mode just to see how it feels, and then I could just load afterwards. But this game does not actually have manual saves, and that's why you can't actually experiment like this. Everything in this game is autosave, and I'm going to go on a tangent here. I really just don't like autosaves in general. Well, I think autosaves are fine so long as you also have the option to manual save. I guess in some genres, you wouldn't want people to be able to save scum. But in terms of a game like this, I don't know why you aren't allowed to make a manual save. Maybe it's because of the fact that this game has multiple endings. They didn't want someone to make a save right before each big story mission. Also, speaking of the story missions, I'm talking about this kind of out of order now. I actually forgot to write this down. But the game has a few missions that will have a special annotation on them that says decision. And at first I had no idea what this meant, right? I was thinking when I first saw this, that decision meant that there would be a decision proposed to me in the middle of the mission. I thought that maybe in the middle of the mission, I have to choose between two targets to eliminate, or maybe I could choose to defend someone or attack them, etc., right? But I only found out afterwards, I only found out after doing my first decision mission, that decision actually means you can only do one decision mission or the other. Because whenever you are presented with a decision mission, it means that you have two different decision missions to choose from. And if you pick one, it means that you can no longer do the other, at least in that playthrough. So maybe that's why they don't want you to be able to do manual saves, because then you could do a manual save before every decision, and you could essentially get every ending and see every ending in less time than the amount of time it takes to do 3 entire playthroughs. But what's the big idea? What's the point? Why couldn't you just let them make a manual save before these decisions to see everything, right? Because even with the game having 3 different endings, I don't think anyone really cares too much about the story in Armored Core games. I don't think story has ever been at the forefront of any kind of mech game, right? It's always supposed to be about the gameplay and the experimentation of different builds. But I say all this to express my discontent that I can't actually experiment and check out all of the OS tuning perks, because there were a lot of things there, and I would have loved to have been able to check everyone out so I could speak confidently about each one. Now, finally, I will speak about the difficulty experience of the game. How difficult is the game, and in what way is it difficult? And as I already alluded, this is the biggest critique of the game from me. I think this is the most significant issue with the game. And yeah, I've been listing off a lot of critiques so far, but everything in comparison to this is pretty minor. Because when it comes to the difficulty of the game, this is something I value greatly, way more than these other things I've been mentioning. So, firstly, is the game hard or easy? This game is actually weirdly easy. And most evidently, it's because in this game, they have introduced checkpoints. Not only have they introduced checkpoints, but you can actually change your mech parts mid-mission when you are respawning. And when I learned about this, I was immediately deflated a little bit. Not necessarily because it makes the game easier per se, but one of my favorite things about playing through Armored Core 2 is that you had to really think about your preparation. When you were about to accept a new mission, you had to read the description of the mission, and you had to imagine and predict what kind of enemies you would be fighting and what kind of environments you would be fighting them in, right? And based on what you could infer from the description of the mission, that would influence what you decide to take with you, right? And so it was almost similar to Monster Hunter. Part of the fun of Monster Hunter, at least pre-world Monster Hunter, is that you had to really consider, okay, I have a finite amount of inventory, so what should I bring, right? What should I bring with me? Because once I'm out there, if I'm lacking something, I'm either going to have to do without, or I'm just going to have to find it out there in the field somewhere. So likewise in Armored Core, as I was saying, one of my favorite things about Armored Core 2 is I really had to think for a few minutes, which weapons should I take with me? Will I be fighting airborne enemies? Will I be fighting grounded enemies, or a combination thereof? Will I be fighting outdoors? Will I be fighting indoors? Will we have a lot of cover, etc.? Those are the kinds of things you should consider, right? And that should influence your build. Also, you should think about how long the mission is. So for example, you could take a really strong gun that has a finite amount of ammo, or maybe you would want to take a gun that isn't as strong but has a lot more ammo, so that way you would be less at risk of running out of ammo, right? A lot of times I would opt for taking a weaker weapon just because I knew it would have way more ammo, right? But that is completely obsolete in this game. So you might be noticing a trend, right, of things just not requiring as much thought in this game. You no longer have to think about how you are going to land. You no longer have to think about how you are going to lead your shots. You no longer have to think about what weapons you are going to take in a mission. Because like I said, if you die out in a mission, not only are you going to respawn at a checkpoint, but you can swap your parts out. Also, when you respawn with full ammo. So there is no longer any kind of value in considering a weapon that is weaker but with more ammo, because you can just always take the weapons that do the most damage regardless of how finite their ammo is, because you can just let yourself die, or inevitably you'll die once you run out of ammo, and then when you respawn, you are fully topped off again. And if you get to a boss, you don't have to worry about having the right build for the boss, because let's say you're doing a mission. Let's say it's a mission you've already attempted, right? And you already know it's in the mission. And let's say it's a mission with a boss at the end, and you think, okay, should I take a loadout that is really good for everything leading up to the boss, but might not necessarily be good for the boss? Or should I take a build and a loadout that might not necessarily be good for everything leading up to the boss, but once I get to that boss is toast, because this build is specifically to fight the boss, and I can just run past everything leading up to him, right? Again, you don't have to think about any of that. I will say, though, there is actually one mission in the game that I experienced, because I didn't play every single mission, considering this does have branching paths because of the decision missions, right? So there are some decision missions that I never got to play. But one of the decision missions I played, the one in which you fight, well, I don't want to spoil it, but I uploaded a video of it. I think it's called Eliminate the Red Guns, that mission. That mission was my favorite in the entire game, and it's precisely because this was the one mission I experienced with no checkpoints, and it had a boss at the end, right? And so I actually had to think about ammo in this mission. This was the one case in which I actually was running out of ammo at the end, and I eventually had to end up going for these energy weapons so that way I could actually conserve enough ammo for the end. And I was actually having a ton of fun in this mission, and I wish there were more missions like this. And it was precisely because this mission had no checkpoints. So there was one mission like this, but all the other missions, the stakes were completely gone. And what's funny is that in the first few hours of the game, I obviously came to the same conclusions then as I have now about the checkpoint system and the mid-mission part swapping system. But near the end of Chapter 1, and in Chapter 2, I actually started to think that it was okay, because by adding checkpoints and part swapping mid-mission to make the game easier, even though that inherently makes the game easier, it could allow the devs to have the freedom to make the bosses actually difficult, right? Give us some of that difficult boss fight formula that FromSoft has become known for ever since Dark Souls has popped off so hard, right? And that would definitely be something that this game could do better than the other Armored Core games. Because even though, like I said, I really enjoyed the whole preparation aspect of missions in Armored Core 2, none of the boss fights were ever particularly difficult. There was never a boss fight in Armored Core 2 that was actually challenging. The challenge came from making sure that you had managed your health and resources up to the point of fighting the boss, right? Because you could just spray and pray, use up all of your ammo, and get hit a bunch in a mission, and then when you get to the boss, you don't have ammo or health, right? And then the boss would be hard. So again, it was about resource management and doing everything very efficiently and thoroughly, so that way you can get to the boss with enough resources. Because when you get to the boss, even if the boss is easy, it stresses you out a bit because you think, oh no, if I die here, I'm going to have to redo the entire mission, right? That was the fun of the old Armored Cores, at least Armored Core 2 in my case, right? But like I said, by adding checkpoints, that gives the devs freedom to make the boss as difficult as they want, because now they don't have to worry about the player feeling disheartened by having to restart the mission from the beginning. And also, if they end up having a bad build for any particular boss, they can always just swap out their parts when they respawn, right? And I was starting to think that this is what they were going for with the Chapter 1 boss and the Chapter 2 boss. So the Chapter 1 boss, Balteus, that was the first time anything in the game felt somewhat challenging. It wasn't that hard. It took me less than 10 tries. I think it took me about, I don't know, maybe like 5 or 6 tries to beat Balteus. I thought it was pretty fun. I thought that was a really cool first boss. The set piece was amazing. The atmosphere, the build up to it, it was really cool. It was a very memorable boss fight, right? So after the Balteus fight, I was thinking, all right, okay, maybe I should just let FromSoft cook. Maybe this is the vision they had, right? Because even though I think that the checkpoint system makes most of the missions boring, if there's a really tough boss fight, yeah, I think there should be a checkpoint if the boss is actually difficult. Because if the boss is actually difficult, if a boss actually takes a ton of tries, I would not want to have to go through the entire mission every time to fight them, right? But with me respawning right there, I don't mind how many tries it takes. It could take a ton of tries, right? And this was more true for the Chapter 2 boss. So the Chapter 2 boss, Sea Spider. Sea Spider is actually the only thing I actually would consider difficult in this entire game. Like I said, Balteus only took about maybe 5 or 6 tries. But Sea Spider, the amount of tries that one took, it was at least 10. I know it was in the double digits. I think it took me about an hour to beat it, maybe an hour and a half. So a lot longer than anything else in the game, the Sea Spider, right? And so that got me really excited. That was making me think, okay, the Chapter 1 boss was kind of challenging. The Chapter 2 boss was actually challenging. Now I can't wait to see what the Chapter 3, 4, and 5 bosses are like. Because I already looked it up online to see how many chapters were in the game, and I saw that it said 5. So I was thinking, okay, I'm in store for at least 3 more really epic boss fights, right? And so I'm hoping that they are going to be really difficult, in which case I actually think the checkpoint system is completely validated because, like I said, the checkpoint system would be a way to compensate for them wanting to make the bosses really difficult. but nothing else in the game was nearly as challenging as Sea Spider. I don't know if it's because everything else is actually easier, or maybe Sea Spider was just the biggest difficulty spike. And once I got used to that, I was able to deal with anything the game threw at me, right? Also, that leads me to another critique about this game regarding the chapters and the chapter bosses. The pacing of this game is all over the place, okay? So Balteus was at the end of chapter 1, like I said, right? And then you start chapter 2, and chapter 2 is, I think, maybe like 4 missions. Chapter 2 only has about 4 missions. And so you do the chapter 1 boss fight in Balteus, and then pretty much immediately after, you start doing the chapter 2 fight. And then when you go into chapter 3 has more missions than any other chapter in the game. So I was thinking, okay, that's fine. It is the middle chapter after all. Maybe the middle just has the most missions, but it'll make up for it with a really epic boss fight at the end. The boss fight at the end of chapter 3, I'm not spoiling it, but it's not even a fight. It's more of just a cinematic thing. It's more of just a cinematic interaction. And I beat it on my first try because, like I said, it wasn't even really a boss. It was just this cinematic interactive thing. It's not a QTE, but it might as well be a QTE. And the chapter 4 boss I beat on my second try, and the final boss I also beat on my second try, which I was extremely disappointed with because, come on, why is a final boss going to take me 2 tries? Also, speaking of the boss fights, the arena missions, which aren't really technically boss fights, but they might as well be boss fights, after the first few arena matches, because that's when I was actually still kind of learning the game, right? So after I got comfortable with the game and after I did the first few arena fights, I kid you not, every single arena fight after the first few I beat on my first try. I literally just slapped on the double bazookas and put the tank treads on, and I was able to stat check every single fight in the arena. Even the top 3, when you get into the S rank, I kept on thinking, okay, the next batch will have a challenging one, the next batch will have a challenging one, and it never happened, which I thought was really disappointing. Because in Armored Core 2, like I said, none of the actual boss fights in the missions were difficult per se, but that didn't bother me because I could still get my 1v1 boss fight itch scratched in the arena missions because the arena missions are just the fights, right? You start the fight, and if you die, you can just immediately retry that fight. So that's where I kind of considered the boss fight stuff to be, even if they aren't technically boss fights. And even though the arena fights weren't super challenging in Armored Core 2, even though I did blitz through most of them on the first try, what would happen in Armored Core 2 is I would blitz through maybe about 5 of them, and then I would find one that took me multiple tries. Every now and then you would just find a gatekeeper, right? And then you would beat him because you would find the right build, and then you would blitz through some more, and then you would find a difficult one, and then you would blitz through some more and find a difficult one, and that seemed to be the pace of the arena challenges, for me at least, in Armored Core 2. But like I said, every single one past the first few, once I learned the game, I literally beat on first try, so it was literally just a way of getting more of those resources to max out my OS tuning, those perks, right? So again, this is the thing that is most disappointing to me about Armored Core 6. How weirdly easy the game is. I don't need it to be super tough, right? I know Armored Core isn't necessarily supposed to be a super challenging series, but I would at least like the final boss to take more than 2 tries. I will say, though, that after being disappointed about the final boss being so easy, that is when I decided to try the PvP, because I actually saved the PvP for after I beat the game, and the PvP is actually really nice. I was not expecting that, because I have a very low opinion of multiplayer in Dark Souls games, so I was kind of expecting the multiplayer to be super jank in this game, but the multiplayer is actually really solid, and I had a lot of fun with it, and I'm actually thinking I might make this a regular game on my Twitch channel just to do the PvP matches maybe once a week or something like that, because Gundam Evolution is getting shut down soon, and I'm going to need to replace Gundam Evolution with some other kind of PvP mech thing that isn't Gundam Versus, right? Also, a couple other minor complaints that I wrote down, but they didn't really necessarily fall into any category, is that, for one, you cannot use the repair kit which is basically your Estus flask in this game. You cannot use the repair kit while firing weapons with recoil. At least I think it's just the weapons with recoil. I didn't test out everything, but this is the conclusion I came to. I realized this when I was fighting the sea spider. I was trying to do the repair kit. I was trying to use the repair kit in some instances in which I was firing at the boss, and I realized it wasn't working. And I knew my controller wasn't broken or anything. And so upon more experimentation, I realized that if I were firing a weapon that induces some kind of big recoil state, I couldn't actually use the repair kit, which I thought, okay, that might make sense if I'm in a mech with the bipedal legs or something, right? Because if you have bipedal legs on, if you have anything on other than the tank treads and you fire a big weapon that induces a lot of recoil, like a bazooka or a grenade launcher, you get locked into this recoil animation in which you can't do anything, right? So I was thinking, okay, that makes sense. Because you're supposed to be locked into a recoil animation, I guess not being able to do anything would also include not being able to do a repair kit. But I was using the tank treads, and one of the whole points of using the tank treads is that it lets you fire weapons without having to pay the recoil. So I was using double bazookas, or I think actually I was using double miniguns in the sea spider fight. I was using double miniguns, right? So normally, if you weren't using tank treads, you would have to be absorbing a lot of recoil with the miniguns. But with the tank treads, you're able to still move around freely because, like I said, that's one of the perks of having tank treads instead of any other type of leg. So I was thinking that because using tank treads alleviates the issues associated with the recoil of these heavy weapons, I shouldn't be having to deal with any issue of the recoil. But like I said, you can't use the repair kit even if you are freely moving around with tank treads while firing the miniguns. So I don't know if this was a deliberate design decision. It sounds as if it could be a bug or maybe just some kind of weird oversight, right? So that's not a big deal, but I did find it weird, and I would not be surprised if that gets fixed in a patch. And the other thing I wrote down, and this really isn't that big of a deal, but if I had to pick on the game some more, if I had to bully the game a little bit more than I already have, is that some of the environments are weirdly non-destructible. I would expect more elements in the environment to be destructible, honestly, because a lot of times I would walk over something or walk into something or shoot something or crash into something, and I was expecting it to break, but they didn't break. They just stood weirdly static. That was a little immersion breaking, especially with Armored Core being so heavily associated with the PS2. I know Armored Core 1 started with the PS1, but I associate it more with the PS2, right? Considering Armored Core 2 and 3 were both on the PS2. And I associate the PS2 with destructible environments because around that time, it seems that devs started to realize the fun of destructible environments, and that kind of became a thing in PS2 era games. At least I think so. Maybe a PS1 game or older originated it, right? But I associate destructible environments with PS2 era games. And I think it's weird how destructible environments don't really seem to be a thing that's brought up in gaming these days. It seems as if all these devs are so obsessed with increasing their budget to make games just a tiny bit more photorealistic, and they obsess over making things look real and the lighting, right, with all this ray tracing and stuff. But I would rather them focus on things that actually make the games more fun, such as destructible environments. And I think a mech game is the perfect place to have destructible environments, right? So again, that's just a very small critique, something I would just want to throw in, because the whole point of me making this video isn't to de-incentivize people from buying the game. I already said the game is worth the money, right? I just wish people were being more critical of the game, because with this game selling well, we will probably get an Armored Core 7. And if we do get an AC7, I would like for AC7 to improve a lot of the things that I have already mentioned in this video. Because if they only hear people praising Armored Core 6 as a 10 out of 10, they might just make Armored Core 7 identical to 6, which I would not want, right? So thank you for listening, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it insightful in terms of my perception on the game. And if you have played the game yourself, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. So with all that said, I will see you guys later, and bye for now.